September 15th, 1944. The English Channel churned beneath a steady rain as landing ship tank number 347 approached Portsmouth Harbour. Below deck, in the converted cargo hold, 400 German prisoners of war sat in silence, their uniforms still caked with Normandy mud. Most were barely 20 years old. They had been told by their officers that capture meant certain death. The British, they had been warned, showed no mercy to prisoners. They would be tortured, starved, worked to death in labour camps. Some had seen the propaganda films. British soldiers executing surrendering Germans, Allied bombers targeting hospitals. These young men prepared themselves for the worst as the ship's engines slowed and the harbour lights grew brighter. What happened next would shatter everything they believed about their enemies and transform not just their own lives, but the very nature of how nations treat captured soldiers. The story of German prisoners of war in Britain during World War II is not the story anyone expected to unfold. It is a narrative that reveals how humanity can triumph over hatred, how practical wisdom can overcome the desire for revenge, and how treating enemies with dignity can become one of the most powerful weapons in any conflict. The mathematics of prisoner treatments were being calculated not in terms of punishment, but in terms of transformation. What the German High Command never anticipated was that Britain would wage psychological warfare not through brutality, but through unexpected kindness. The weapon they deployed was not the lash or the starvation ration, but the simple act of serving tea to men who had spent years trying to destroy everything Britain represented. The journey to this revolutionary approach began long before the first German soldier set foot on British soil. In the early months of the war, Britain faced a fundamental problem that military planners had never seriously considered. What do you do with thousands of enemy prisoners when your own island is under siege? The initial solution seemed obvious: send them as far away as possible. During 1940 and 1941, every German and Italian prisoner captured by British forces was immediately shipped to Canada. The reasoning was straightforward. Britain was fighting for its very survival. Food was rationed. Cities were being bombed nightly. The last thing the nation needed was the burden of feeding and housing enemy soldiers who might escape and sabotage the war effort. By late 1942, nearly 9,000 German prisoners were being held in Canadian camps, while fewer than 2,000 remained in Britain at any given time. This policy worked perfectly until it suddenly became completely impossible. The problem was success. British and American forces fighting in North Africa were winning too decisively. When German and Italian resistance finally collapsed in Tunisia in May 1943, the Allies found themselves with an unexpected crisis of victory. 260,000 enemy prisoners needed immediate housing, feeding, and transportation. The logistics of shipping such numbers to Canada would have required an entire fleet of troop ships that were desperately needed for other operations. Vice Admiral Emery Land, chairman of the United States Maritime Commission, examined the situation with growing alarm. His classified correspondence revealed the scale of the challenge facing the Allies. We have more prisoners than we have ships to transport them. More prisoners than we have camps to house them. More prisoners than we have personnel to guard them. The Germans and Italians surrendered faster than our administrative systems could process them. Success in North Africa has created a humanitarian crisis that threatens to overwhelm our entire prisoner management infrastructure. The Americans and British had previously agreed to split all captured enemy personnel 50-50, regardless of which nation's forces had actually taken them prisoner. This meant that Britain suddenly faced the prospect of housing and managing over 100,000 enemy soldiers on home soil. The decision to keep German prisoners in Britain rather than shipping them to distant dominions would prove to be one of the most consequential policy changes of the entire war. But even the North African influx paled compared to what followed D-Day. Within weeks of the Normandy landings, German prisoners were arriving in Britain by the thousands daily. The systematic German defence of France collapsed faster than anyone had predicted, and entire divisions surrendered en masse. By autumn 1944, the small fleet of landing ship tanks that had been detailed to transport prisoners across the Channel was running a continuous shuttle service. Portsmouth, Gosport, and Southampton became processing centres for the largest prisoner of war operation in British history. The organisational challenge was staggering. British authorities developed an alphabetical system for managing the influx. Prisoners whose surnames began with letters in the first half of the alphabet were sent to the United States. Those with surnames beginning with letters in the second half stayed in Britain. This seemingly arbitrary division was actually carefully calculated. The Americans needed prisoners for agricultural labour in the vast farmlands of the Midwest and South. The British needed workers for the more intensive agricultural system of a smaller island nation under siege. The processing centre at Kempton Park Racecourse became the first glimpse of British captivity for thousands of German soldiers. The choice of venue was deliberate and symbolic. Rather than using a forbidding military installation, British authorities selected a site associated with sport and entertainment. The message was subtle but clear. These prisoners were entering a nation that maintained civilized values even in wartime. What the arriving Germans encountered defied everything their propaganda had prepared them for. Instead of brutal interrogation and summary execution, they found systematic processing designed to ensure their basic needs were met. Medical examinations identified those requiring immediate treatment. Clothing was provided to replace damaged uniforms. Most shocking of all, they were given food, real food, hot food, more food than many had seen in months. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established minimum standards for prisoner treatment, but Britain consistently exceeded these requirements. The convention specified that prisoners should receive rations equivalent to those of their captors' garrison troops. British authorities interpreted this generously, ensuring that German prisoners received the same quality and quantity of food as British soldiers stationed in Britain. Given the severe rationing that British civilians endured throughout the war, this meant prisoners often ate better than the general population. The psychological impact of this treatment was immediate and profound. Hans Müller, a 19-year-old Wehrmacht private captured near Caen, later recalled his first meal in British captivity. We had been told that the British would starve us, that they would torture us for information, that we would be worked to death in their factories. Instead, they gave us tea, real tea with milk and sugar. I had not tasted sugar in 6 months. The guard who brought it was polite, even apologetic that there was no cake to go with it. I thought I was dreaming. My comrades thought the British were trying to poison us. We could not understand why our enemies were being kind to us. This kindness was not accidental. British policymakers understood that their treatment of German prisoners would directly influence how German forces treated captured British soldiers. The policy was reciprocal and strategic. Every German prisoner who experienced humane treatment became a potential advocate for similar treatment of British prisoners in German camps. More subtly, British authorities recognised that well-treated prisoners were more likely to cooperate with interrogation, less likely to attempt escape, and could be more effectively utilised as a labour force. The camp system that emerged across Britain was unlike anything the German prisoners had experienced or expected. Rather than concentrating all prisoners in massive installations, British authorities established over 400 smaller camps distributed across the entire country. Many utilised existing facilities, former military bases, vacant country estates, even abandoned holiday camps were converted for prisoner use. The dispersed system served multiple purposes. It prevented any single camp from becoming overcrowded. It distributed the economic impact of prisoner labour across many communities. Most importantly, it made mass escape attempts virtually impossible. The daily routine in these camps reflected Britain's determination to maintain Geneva Convention standards. Despite wartime pressures, prisoners were awakened at 6 in the morning with hot tea delivered to their barracks. Breakfast consisted of porridge, bread, butter, and jam. The bread was white bread, a luxury that many German soldiers had not seen since before the war began. Lunch typically included hot soup, meat, potatoes, and vegetables. Dinner featured similar fare with additional rations for those engaged in heavy labour. Medical care exceeded convention requirements. British doctors visited camps regularly, providing both emergency treatment and routine health care. Dental care was available to all prisoners. German medical personnel among the prisoners were encouraged to practice their profession, treating fellow prisoners under British supervision. The medical facilities established in the camps often provided better health care than many German soldiers had received in their own military. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of British prisoner treatment was the recognition that these young men needed more than physical sustenance. They needed mental stimulation, social interaction, and hope for the future. Camp libraries were established, stocked with books in German as well as English. Educational programs were developed, allowing prisoners to continue interrupted studies or learn new skills. Many camps organised orchestras, theatre groups, and sports teams that performed not only for fellow prisoners, but for local British audiences. The transformation this created was remarkable. Within months, German prisoners who had arrived expecting death or torture were writing letters home, describing their captivity in terms their families could barely believe. The letters, censored by British authorities, revealed the psychological revolution taking place in camps across Britain. "We are treated better here than we were in our own army," wrote Corporal Fritz Zimmermann from a camp in Yorkshire. "The British guards are polite, the food is good, we have books to read and music to play. I am learning English and hope to study at university after the war." My mother will not believe this letter, but it is all true. This treatment was not universal or without controversy. Some British officials argued that enemy prisoners deserved harsher treatment, especially as reports of German atrocities became widely known. Some members of Parliament questioned whether scarce resources should be devoted to the comfort of enemy soldiers while British civilians endured rationing and bombing. The debate reflected a fundamental tension between the desire for revenge and the strategic value of humane treatment. The resolution of this debate would prove crucial not only for the immediate management of hundreds of thousands of prisoners, but for the broader question of how democratic societies should conduct themselves even in total war. The British approach was about to face its greatest test as prisoner numbers continued to grow and the true scale of Nazi atrocities became undeniable. The question was whether Britain could maintain its commitment to humane treatment when every instinct called for retaliation. The answer came from an unexpected source. Churchill himself, despite his reputation for ruthless prosecution of the war, became one of the strongest advocates for maintaining Geneva Convention standards. His reasoning was characteristically pragmatic and far-sighted. In a classified memorandum to the War Office dated October 1944, the Prime Minister outlined his position with typical clarity. "We are not fighting this war to become like our enemies. Every German prisoner who experiences British justice and British decency becomes a witness to the values we are defending. When this war ends, these men will return to Germany carrying with them the memory of how a civilized nation conducts itself. That memory may prove more valuable than any military victory." The Prime Minister's directive was implemented across the entire camp system with remarkable consistency. Camp commandants received explicit instructions that any mistreatment of prisoners would result in immediate court-martial. British guards underwent training that emphasised the strategic importance of proper prisoner treatment. The message was clear and uncompromising. Professional conduct toward prisoners was not optional courtesy, it was military necessity. The results of this policy became evident as prisoner populations swelled throughout 1944 and early 1945. By the war's end, over 400,000 German prisoners were housed in British camps, making Britain one of the largest prisoner-holding nations in the conflict. The administrative achievement was staggering. These prisoners were not simply warehoused, they were integrated into a comprehensive system that provided housing, feeding, medical care, education, and meaningful work for nearly 500,000 enemy soldiers. The work programme became the most visible aspect of prisoner integration with British society. Initially, only volunteers were assigned to labour outside the camps. The response was overwhelming. German prisoners, accustomed to military discipline and eager for activity beyond camp routine, volunteered in numbers that exceeded available positions. By 1945, prisoner labour was contributing significantly to British agricultural production, forestry management, and reconstruction efforts in bombed cities. The irony was profound and not lost on contemporary observers. German prisoners were helping to rebuild the very cities that German bombers had destroyed. In London, prisoners cleared rubble from the East End neighbourhoods that had been devastated during the Blitz. In Coventry, they assisted in reconstructing the cathedral that Luftwaffe raids had reduced to ruins. The sight of German soldiers working alongside British civilians to repair war damage created cognitive dissonance that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of enemy and ally. Agricultural work proved most significant for long-term prisoner integration. Britain's agricultural labour force had been depleted by military conscription, and food production was critical for national survival. German prisoners filled this gap with enthusiasm that surprised their British supervisors. By 1946, prisoners accounted for approximately 20% of Britain's agricultural workforce. They worked in fields across England, Scotland, and Wales, living in hostels and boarding houses, earning wages and forming relationships with local communities that would endure for decades. The personal transformations that resulted were documented in thousands of letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies. Werner Schmidt, captured at 19 during the Battle of the Bulge, spent 2 years working on a Yorkshire farm. His memoir, published in Germany in 1967, described an experience that fundamentally altered his understanding of Britain and democracy. The farmer who employed me, Mr. Thompson, treated me as he would any hired man. He paid fair wages, provided good meals, and invited me to join his family for Sunday dinner. His son had been killed fighting in North Africa against German forces, yet this man showed me kindness that I had never received from my own officers. When I asked him why he did not hate me, he said that hating individual soldiers would not bring his son back, but treating me well might help prevent future wars. These individual relationships multiplied across hundreds of communities. German prisoners played football with local teams, attended church services alongside British congregations, and participated in community celebrations. The Football Association initially prohibited matches between prisoner teams and British clubs, but local pressure forced a reversal of this policy. By 1946, prisoner teams were competing in regional leagues, and their matches drew enthusiastic crowds of British supporters. Cultural exchange flourished in unexpected ways. German prisoners organised concerts featuring classical music that many rural British communities had never experienced. British audiences discovered German composers beyond Wagner and developed appreciation for musical traditions they had previously associated only with the enemy. Prison camp orchestras performed Beethoven and Bach in village halls across Britain, creating moments of transcendence that temporarily erased the boundaries between victor and vanquished. Educational programs expanded beyond basic literacy and language instruction. German prisoners attended university extension courses, learned trades, and pursued professional qualifications. The British government recognised that educated prisoners would become more effective advocates for democracy when they returned to Germany. Prisoner education was not charity, it was investment in post-war European reconstruction. The most ambitious educational initiative was the re-education programme designed specifically for younger prisoners who had grown up under Nazi indoctrination. These programmes, conducted by German-speaking British officers and anti-Nazi German prisoners, introduced democratic political concepts, critical thinking skills, and alternative historical narratives. The goal was not to create British sympathisers, but to develop Germans capable of participating in democratic institutions. The effectiveness of these programmes became evident in prisoner behaviour and attitudes. Camp discipline problems decreased as prisoners recognised that cooperation brought privileges and opportunities. Escape attempts became rare, not because security was overwhelming, but because prisoners saw little advantage in returning to a Germany under Allied occupation when they could remain in Britain with decent treatment and meaningful work. The few escape attempts that did occur revealed the complex psychology of men caught between loyalty and pragmatism. Most escapees were recaptured within days, not because British security was omnipresent, but because the prisoners themselves had no clear destination or purpose. Germany was occupied, devastated, and offered little hope for the future. Britain, paradoxically, provided German prisoners with better prospects than their homeland. This paradox created profound psychological conflicts for many prisoners. Letters home described comfortable conditions, adequate food, and respectful treatment, but also expressed guilt about living better than families in occupied Germany. Some prisoners requested permission to send portions of their wages to relatives in Germany. British authorities generally approved such requests, recognising that prisoners maintaining family connections were less likely to cause problems and more likely to serve as positive ambassadors for British treatment. The religious dimensions of prisoner life added another layer of complexity to the British approach. Camp chaplains, both British and German, provided spiritual guidance that helped prisoners cope with separation, uncertainty, and guilt about their wartime actions. Sunday services became opportunities for reflection and community building that transcended national boundaries. Many prisoners later credited these religious experiences with providing the moral framework for their post-war lives. Christmas celebrations in the camps represented the fullest expression of British policy toward German prisoners. Rather than ignoring or suppressing German holiday traditions, camp administrators encouraged prisoners to organise their own celebrations, while also inviting them to participate in British Christmas customs. The result was a unique fusion of traditions that demonstrated how cultural differences could coexist and enrich rather than conflict. Christmas 1944 provided a particularly poignant example of this cultural synthesis. At Camp 174 in Gloucestershire, German prisoners organised a traditional Christmas market in the camp compound, crafting decorations and small gifts to sell to local British families. The proceeds were donated to a local children's charity that supported war orphans. British families attended the market, purchasing handmade items from men who months earlier had been shooting at British soldiers. The scene captured the transformation that humane treatment could create in the most unlikely circumstances. The success of British prisoner treatment began attracting international attention as the war neared its end. Representatives from neutral countries, particularly Sweden and Switzerland, visited British camps and reported favourably on conditions they observed. These reports influenced prisoner treatment in other Allied nations and contributed to the development of enhanced international standards for prisoner care. American officials, dealing with their own large prisoner populations, studied British methods and adopted many British practices. The exchange of information between Allied nations created a convergence around humane treatment standards that exceeded Geneva Convention minimums. This cooperation laid groundwork for post-war international humanitarian law and established precedents that would influence prisoner treatment in subsequent conflicts. The approaching end of the war created new challenges for prisoner management. As Allied victory became inevitable, questions arose about repatriation timing, prisoner selection for continued detention, and the role former prisoners might play in post-war Germany. British authorities recognised that their treatment of German prisoners during the war would significantly influence post-war German attitudes toward Britain and democracy generally. The psychological transformation of German prisoners held in Britain was becoming a strategic asset that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. These men were potential ambassadors for democratic values and British interests in a post-war Germany that would need complete reconstruction. The investment in humane treatment was about to pay dividends that no one had fully anticipated when the policy was first implemented. The strategic value of this psychological transformation became undeniable as reports filtered back from repatriated prisoners who had returned to Germany during prisoner exchanges. These men carried with them stories that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had claimed about British brutality. In letters intercepted by German censors, former prisoners described their captivity in terms that German authorities found deeply troubling. "The British fed us better than our own quartermaster corps," wrote one returned prisoner. "They gave us medical care when we were sick, books when we were bored, and work when we needed purpose. I have never been treated with such dignity, not even by my own officers." These testimonies created cracks in the Nazi narrative that Allied enemies were subhuman monsters bent on German destruction. German military intelligence began documenting what they called the British prisoner problem, recognizing that their own soldiers were returning from captivity as inadvertent advocates for their former captors. The psychological warfare implications were staggering. Britain was winning hearts and minds not through propaganda broadcasts or leaflet drops, but through the simple expedient of treating enemy soldiers like human beings. The German High Command attempted to counter this narrative by restricting information from returned prisoners and emphasizing isolated incidents of harsh treatment. But the testimonies were too numerous and too consistent to suppress entirely. Word spread through German military units that surrender to the British meant survival, adequate treatment, and eventual return home. This knowledge affected German fighting morale in subtle but measurable ways. Resistance became less fanatical when soldiers understood that defeat did not mean death. British intelligence officers recognized the strategic value of this psychological advantage and began exploiting it systematically. Leaflets dropped over German positions included testimonies from German prisoners describing their treatment in British camps. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with prisoners who spoke positively about their captivity. The message was consistent and powerful. Surrender means survival. Resistance means unnecessary death. The effectiveness of this psychological operation became evident in surrender rates as Allied forces advanced into Germany itself. Entire German units began surrendering to British forces specifically rather than to Soviet forces, having heard that British captivity offered better prospects for survival. The reputation for humane treatment became a tactical advantage that reduced casualties on both sides while accelerating German collapse. But the most profound impact of British prisoner policy would not become apparent until after the war ended. The 400,000 German prisoners who had experienced British captivity represented a significant portion of Germany's military-age male population. These men would return to a devastated homeland, carrying with them first-hand knowledge of how democratic societies functioned. Their experiences would influence German reconstruction in ways that policymakers were only beginning to understand. The challenge facing British authorities as victory approached was how to maintain their commitment to humane treatment while managing the practical realities of post-war reconstruction. The prisoners had become a valuable labour force, contributing significantly to British agricultural production and urban rebuilding efforts. Many had developed skills, relationships, and economic arrangements that made their immediate repatriation problematic, both for Britain and for the prisoners themselves. The question of repatriation timing became increasingly controversial as the war ended. Some British officials argued that prisoners should be returned to Germany immediately to assist in reconstruction efforts there. Others contended that prisoners who wished to remain in Britain should be allowed to do so, particularly those who had developed specialised skills or close community ties. The debate reflected broader questions about the relationship between victor and vanquished in the post-war order. International law provided limited guidance for these unprecedented circumstances. The Geneva Convention required repatriation of prisoners after hostilities ended, but did not specify timing or procedures for managing prisoners who might not wish to return to their homeland. The question became more complex when reports emerged about conditions in Soviet-occupied Germany, where returned German prisoners faced potential persecution as traitors for having surrendered rather than fighting to the death. The British government found itself in the unexpected position of protecting German prisoners from forced repatriation to harsh conditions in their own country. This protective stance reflected both humanitarian concerns and practical recognition that forced repatriation would undermine everything Britain had achieved through humane treatment during the war. The prisoners had been transformed from enemies into assets. Their forced return to uncertain conditions would waste the investment in their rehabilitation. Labour shortages in post-war Britain complicated repatriation decisions further. The prisoners had become integrated into agricultural production, construction projects, and manufacturing operations that would suffer significant disruption if they were suddenly withdrawn. British farmers, many of whom had developed personal relationships with German workers, petitioned the government to allow prisoners to remain voluntarily. Construction companies working on post-war reconstruction projects made similar requests. The economic argument for retaining willing prisoners was compelling. These men had been trained in British methods, understood local conditions, and had proven themselves reliable workers. Replacing them with untrained British workers would reduce productivity at a time when maximum efficiency was needed for post-war recovery. The prisoners themselves often preferred remaining in Britain to returning to an uncertain future in occupied Germany. Individual stories illustrated the human complexity of repatriation decisions. Heinrich Weber, a former Wehrmacht engineer captured in Normandy, had spent 18 months working on reconstruction projects in Birmingham. He had learned English, developed expertise in British construction techniques, and formed close friendships with British colleagues. His employer offered him permanent employment and assistance with immigration procedures. His wife and children in Germany were living in Soviet-occupied territory under harsh conditions. Weber faced an agonizing choice between family loyalty and personal opportunity. Similar dilemmas confronted thousands of prisoners across Britain. Many had left Germany as teenagers and returned as young adults with new skills, perspectives, and relationships. Some had met British women and wished to marry. Others had discovered career opportunities that did not exist in devastated Germany. The rigid categories of enemy and ally that had defined wartime relationships were dissolving into complex personal situations that defied simple solutions. British public opinion on prisoner repatriation was divided and evolving. Many Britons had initially supported harsh treatment for German prisoners, viewing them as representatives of a regime that had bombed British cities and killed British soldiers. but daily contact with individual prisoners had humanized former enemies and created sympathy for their situations. Local communities that had benefited from prisoner labor often supported allowing prisoners to remain voluntarily. The transformation maintained even under extreme circumstances. The policy had educated both captors and captives about the possibilities for treating German prisoners humanely. Britain had an affiliation between former enemies, religious its own population, that democratic values could be of public attitudes reflected the broader success of British prisoner policy. By only gained strategic advantages during the war, but had also demonstrated Todd relationships with German prisoners through chapel about prisoner repatriation. Many British churches had developed leaders played a crucial role in shaping public opinion prisoners as individuals rather than symbols. Repatriation reflected deeper questions about 8 Christian principles of compass Britain's role in post-Nazi programs and international reconciliation. Their of enemy ideology argued that forced repatriation would violate church leaders waste opportunities to community outreach efforts and woo for promoting advocacy carried significant weight with a public that increasingly viewed the debate over prisoner available resources, including willing prioritize European reconstruction by returning trained workers. Todd would influence British foreign policy for decades to come. Parliamentary Germany. The questions had no easy answers. Anwar Europe. Should Britain focus on rebuilding its own economy using to peace? Conservative prisoner labour? Or should Britain reconstruction, while Liberal members generally supported using prisoner labour for British and Labour members emphasised humanitarian obligations to interest and international responsibility. The resolution are logical divisions about the balanced subsequent conflicts. The principles, large refugee and precedents for managing facilitate family reunification. The debates reflected broader-eyed displaced person populations. In between national of these debates would establish developed for handling German and Vietnamese 1956 UG prisoners would influence policies society provided toward Hungarian refugees in Undan Asians in 1972 integrating former enemies into British 1970s. The experience of successfully boat people in the crises throughout template for addressing humanitarian the post-war era, but built with prisoner communities. The process needed to be voluntary rather than coercive, agree the logistics of repatriation, while maintaining the British authorities in 1945 was managing the immediate challenge facing positive relationships that had been dual rather than precipitous, and respectful of individual circumstances rather than bureaucratically rigid. The success or failure of repatriation would determine whether Britain's wartime investment in humane prisoner treatment would pay long-term dividends, or BW debates on prisoner policy revealed the complexity of managing the transition from warristed through poor implementation. The stakes were higher than most observers realised. The 400,000 German prisoners in British custody represented potential ambassadors for democratic values in a Germany that would need to be rebuilt from the ground up. Their experiences and attitudes would influence German society for generations. How Britain managed their return would send a powerful message about democratic principles and would shape German perceptions of British intentions in the post-war world. The transformation of German prisoners from enemies into potential allies represented one of the most successful psychological operations of the entire war. It had been achieved not through coercion or propaganda, but through the consistent application of humane treatment and respect for human dignity. The question now was whether Britain could maintain these principles while managing the complex realities of post-war reconstruction. The answer would come through a series of decisions that revealed the true character of British democracy under pressure. Rather than implementing mass repatriation based on administrative convenience, British authorities developed individualised assessment procedures that respected both legal obligations and personal circumstances. Each prisoner would be evaluated based on his specific situation, skills, family connections, and preferences. Those with compelling reasons to remain would be given pathways to legal residency. Those eager to return home would be repatriated with dignity and assistance. The assessment process became a remarkable exercise in bureaucratic humanity. Immigration officers, social workers, and camp administrators worked together to understand each prisoner's unique circumstances. Heinrich Weber, the engineer from Birmingham, was granted permission to remain and eventually became a British citizen. His expertise contributed to post-war reconstruction projects for decades. Others chose repatriation despite comfortable circumstances in Britain, driven by loyalty to families or homeland attachment that transcended material considerations. The voluntary nature of these decisions created unprecedented cooperation between former enemies. German prisoners who chose repatriation often served as informal ambassadors, carrying messages between separated families and helping to establish communication networks across occupied zones. Those who remained in Britain maintained connections with Germany that facilitated cultural and economic exchange in the post-war period. The personal relationships formed during captivity became bridges between nations that had been at war just months earlier. Medical repatriation presented special challenges that tested British commitment to humane treatment. Wounded prisoners requiring ongoing care posed complex questions about responsibility and resources. British military hospitals had treated German prisoners throughout the war, often providing care superior to what they had received in their own military medical system. Some prisoners had undergone surgery, received prosthetics, or required long-term rehabilitation that made immediate repatriation medically inadvisable. Dr. Margaret Thornton, Chief Medical Officer at the Aldershot Prisoner Hospital, documented cases that illustrated the complexity of medical repatriation decisions. One German pilot, shot down during the Battle of Britain, had lost both legs and required extensive reconstructive surgery. Over 3 years of treatment, he had learned to walk with prosthetics, mastered English, and trained as an accountant. His medical condition made return to devastated Germany problematic, but his family situation in Bavaria demanded consideration. The resolution required coordination between British medical authorities, German civilian administrators, and international relief organisations. These medical cases established precedents for treating war-disabled former enemies that influenced British disability policy for decades. The principle that medical care should continue regardless of nationality or former enemy status became embedded in National Health Service policies when the system was established in 1948. German prisoners who had received British medical care during the war often became advocates for similar universal healthcare systems in Germany. Educational repatriation created different challenges that revealed the long-term impact of British prisoner programs. Hundreds of German prisoners had enrolled in university extension courses, vocational training programs, or professional certification courses during their captivity. Some were within months of completing degrees or qualifications that would significantly improve their post-war prospects. Others had discovered academic interests that had been impossible to pursue during the Nazi period when university access was restricted by political criteria. The question of whether to allow prisoners to complete their educational programs before repatriation divided British authorities. Military officials argued that prolonged detention for educational purposes exceeded Geneva Convention requirements and complicated demobilization procedures. Educational administrators and camp welfare officers contended that interrupting studies would waste investments in prisoner development and reduce their effectiveness as democratic advocates in post-war Germany. The debate reflected broader questions about the purpose of prisoner detention and Britain's obligations to former enemies. The resolution established principles that influenced British educational policy toward refugees and displaced persons for decades. Prisoners within 6 months of completing significant educational programs were permitted to finish their studies before repatriation. Those with exceptional academic promise were offered scholarships to continue their education in Britain as civilian students. The precedent recognised education as a humanitarian right that transcended political boundaries and established Britain's reputation as a nation committed to intellectual development regardless of nationality. Family reunification presented the most emotionally complex repatriation challenges. Many German prisoners had been separated from wives and children for years. Some had received no communication from families in Soviet-occupied zones. Others had learned that their homes had been destroyed and their families displaced to unknown locations. The prospect of returning to Germany without knowing whether their families were alive or where they might be located created agonizing uncertainty. British authorities recognised that forced repatriation under such circumstances would be both inhumane and counterproductive. Working with international Red Cross representatives and nascent German civilian authorities, they established family tracing services that attempted to locate missing relatives and facilitate communication across occupation zones. The process was slow and often unsuccessful, but it demonstrated British commitment to maintaining family bonds, even for former enemies. The Family Tracing Service became a model for post-war refugee assistance programs and established Britain's reputation for humanitarian leadership in managing displaced populations. The personal dedication of British officials who worked unpaid overtime to locate missing German families created lasting gratitude that influenced German attitudes toward Britain for generations. These relationships proved more valuable than any formal diplomatic agreement in establishing foundations for post-war cooperation. Labour repatriation required delicate negotiations between British economic interests, international obligations, and prisoner preferences. The agricultural sector, which employed the largest number of German prisoners, faced severe labour shortages that would worsen dramatically if all prisoners were repatriated simultaneously. British farmers had invested time and resources in training German workers who understood local conditions and had proven themselves reliable and skilled. The economic disruption of mass repatriation would affect food production at a time when rationing continued and European famine threatened. The story that began with 400 young German soldiers expecting torture and death ended with nearly 500,000 men who had experienced something unprecedented in the history of warfare. They returned to Germany not as broken prisoners, but as witnesses to the power of democratic values applied even to enemies. Their testimonies would echo through German society for decades, carrying the message that strength could be expressed through mercy, that victory could be achieved through humanity, and that the most effective weapon against totalitarian ideology was the simple act of treating every human being with dignity. When the last German prisoner was repatriated in 1948, Britain had demonstrated to the world that democratic nations could wage total war without abandoning the principles that made them worth defending. The transformation was complete. What began as military necessity had become moral victory. The tea and food served to enemy soldiers had proven more powerful than any propaganda, more lasting than any battlefield triumph. In choosing humanity over hatred, Britain had not only won the war, but had shown how to win the peace that followed.